this goes back to my very first point. When we're talking about identity for all, we'll start with the basic proposition that, yes.
Just a logistics question. Should we take notes, or are we gonna get a chance to get a copy of the slides?
We'll send you the slides. Anybody wants the slides? You got it.
All right.
And you'll give video, so.
So one of the basic structures that we talked about in the blockchain is that there's this underlying foundation that is like the operating system to your computer. When the blockchain becomes fully functional, you don't need your computer. You're just going to need something to connect to the cloud up there, and the blockchain is the underlying foundation for it. Well, as we go through these slides, I make the case that you need not just the communications layer of the internet, you need a justice layer of the internet, and the underpinnings of that justice layer is identity. You need to be able to have some form of identity that is ubiquitous, that we don't rely upon today. But to get into that, I just want to mention a couple aspects about international law. There are top-down efforts, which essentially are UN-based or governmental-based, and essentially they get as far as humanitarian work in times of crisis and setting some norms. But mostly what you have in international areas that actually works is bottom-up. Compassionate groups that get on planes, fly to other countries to do work from the bottom up. And whether it's just humanitarian nature or whether or not it's actually building marketplaces up. What we want to do is take it to a level that goes past humanitarian, build it up into marketplaces and sharing and working in social networks around the world. As you know, just to give you one, I mean, this is very powerful stuff. You had a whole revolution. The Arab Spring, of course, was a very significant example of a revolution that took place from the bottom up. Of course, what was shown by that particular example was that there was no end game thinking as to what would happen when you created a vacuum and you no longer had power in that environment. So there needs to be some thinking as we're building out the use of these tools, other than just we're going to do it. I'm driven by this particular model of participation, which is the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, primarily driven around the notion of eradicating poverty. And so it's there. How do you eradicate poverty? Well, Sustainable Development Goal 16 really says that you need to have inclusion that's based on the rule of law around the world. And of course, as a lawyer, that's what I will think about. But ultimately, we want to build peaceful and inclusive societies. But what you find is that when you're doing this, in our conversation so far, there's always people raising their hands of, well, what's the role of the government? What happens if the government starts regulating? What happens if the government, and fill in the blank, it doesn't matter. The government really only affects people who are enfranchised by the system. That's, in most cases, about 20 to 25% of people here in the United States. The institutions just don't protect you. They just don't do what they're supposed to be doing. Take, for example, domestic violence. The justice system offers a restraining order. That's if the justice system were a store and domestic violence was what you were going into to help yourself protect yourself against, all the justice system gives you is a restraining order. Well, that's really way too late in the game. Justice really requires giving people options so they don't get themselves into the situation where violence could occur. At least that's one possibility. So, but where does that opportunity happen? That happens in norms. I can tell you that when we did hackathons that were based on the notion that it's domestic violence, it did not occur to me at all. I grew up in a suburban home in Massachusetts. I did not think that such a thing as a man hitting a woman really existed. It was not in my mindset. And then when I went to Albuquerque, where I was running this hackathon, I was told that there was a good half of the population that experienced domestic violence in some form. And then the woman who was organized who works for me got up as one of the victims, and I didn't even know that. I just had to sit down in my chair for a while and just take in how little I knew about the norms of society. Societal norms are what you really need to address and change, and we have an opportunity at this time in history of the world, because this blockchain is going to change everything, because now the entire world's going to be going to this operating system in the cloud all at once. Some of us can stay on the computer, do what we want to on the computer, but you're going to have much more opportunity if you move up there. And if you move up there, there aren't norms there. We're going to be building the norms, and it's up to us to do it. Technology, which drives this, is neutral, it's agnostic. The cyber criminals, the hackers, all the folks on the dark web demonstrated through the adoption of Bitcoin, A, that it works, and B, that you can drive technology in dark ways if you want to. And this thing will build on itself, like anything else. Once you start building a certain set of norms, they tend to take hold and they tend to move forward. So it's up to us to get into the game. And that's an important factor to keep in mind. And this is the legal system of the world. It's paper-based. So it has no connection whatsoever to what we're talking about in the cloud. You have to go to a physical place to get paper-based systems. And again, they're electronic. All they're doing is printing out the paper so that it can be on the other side of the system if it's in a court, and it's going to be hacked. The statutes are all jurisdictionally driven. Each state has its own set of rules. To be in the United States, but every state has its own set of rules. What drives, one thing that's legal here and it's not legal there, and you're operating in a national or global environment, the legal complex is not going to keep up with the changes that technology is driving. Technology makes everything global. The people who have adopted that first and foremost are the cyber hackers. They're doing a wonderful job demonstrating to the world how you can work globally, make money, and basically most of them avoid getting caught. The only ones who get caught are the ones who make mistakes or get too big. The pig principle always works. The ones who are the most greedy are the ones that get caught first. But the legal system isn't changing anytime soon. And so if we're going to make an attempt to make a change here, it's good to take a look at how the internet is actually operating, because if I'm saying that the system is all up in the cloud and that's where the computer is going to be, well, what's it really look like up there? So a little bit of history. That's the ARPANET. That's 1980, 82, so somewhere in that range. It's basically a bunch of computers all network with each other, and it's a bunch of academics who are sharing. Actually, the ARPANET started with the Defense Department, connected to the universities. They were all sharing all kinds of information and projects they were working on. But as you can see, it was basically more or less hardwired to each other. We moved past that, and they all got excited a few years later when you can see those little circles. All of a sudden, you had some nodes. Okay, all of a sudden, you had some central places that people could connect to. And again, it's all across the United States, but around 1992, and again, keep this in mind. So this is not really, a big advance. All you're doing is taking that first system and just sort of saying a couple of nodes exist now, instead of, a lot of different systems connected. You just need to connect to the node that's closest to you, and you're building up there. And this is 1992. And then all of a sudden, in 1995, the Department of Commerce basically said, we're opening up the internet to everybody, because up until then, it was limited as to who could get into it. And what do you have? All of a sudden, there's an explosion. Now everybody's connecting to each other. There's no way that you're regulating anything there. That's just now all kinds of connections are taking place everywhere. But how is this built? Basically, this is a set of communication layers. And thank goodness for the engineers, because without them, this doesn't happen. There was a group called W3C that got organized, and W3C, prior to W3C, it was engineers in all those little places and different parts. They were working on this packet, on that packet. They were working on how you would, route packets between networks, what kinds of data you could move. They were just figuring all this stuff out. And then somewhere along the way, enough engineers said, wait a second, too many of us are working on the same problems in different locations. Let's all get together and create some standards. And so they created a physical layer of standards, a data set of standards, network, transportation, and all of that was the operating system of the internet at that point. And it was only the next layer, the application layer, that they sort of left to all of us. That's where the useful work gets done. And what you've found there in this application layer in the last 10 some odd years or so, you've got all kinds of wonderful games, lots of gaming. Anybody want to play bridge online with people from around the world, or a bridge player? No problem. You can get on, play 10 minutes of bridge, get off. It's incredible. And people who don't use the internet for anything else would do that. But they just, because they love to play bridge, they just found a new way. They're at the table. They don't even think of what's going on behind. So there are a lot of games, of course, eBay and the social networks and so forth, Facebook, all those networks have been built up. They're all driven by a set of norms. In case of bridge, it's the rules, right? Everyone knows what the rules of bridge are for playing. So, that's what underpins the system. If it's going to be some kind of a Dungeons and Dragons type of game, well, norms are already built into that kind of framework. People know what those rules are. But is there justice? Is there a justice system that's functioning up there? Is there the ability to work up there? Well, that was what the blockchain discussion was starting to lead into. And how do we create such a justice layer? Well, what does justice typically cover? Right? It covers regulatory and governance, criminal affairs, commerce, social relationships, and personal relationships. We'll focus on the personal because that's the first that you need to address. But you can see that in the regulatory and governance area, just in terms of Bitcoin and in terms of the money that's moving around, you can see the governments are beginning to jump in to try to manage and protect against fraud. But you also have governments jumping in and saying, hey, there's a more efficient way to issue licenses than to do this all the time. Now, they still want to get the license right on day one, and then they want to verify certain things as you go along. But why shouldn't it be available right here, connected to a blockchain that allows you to show, like you wouldn't be showing, you just connections would take place seamlessly, the way the systems would work. But the justice layer would essentially govern these areas on a global basis. But as I said earlier, it can't happen all at once. It's got to happen incrementally, no different than the communications layer was built incrementally. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. There's going to be different testing that's going to go along. And so what happened first with the net? Ultimately, the goal was universal connectivity through communication protocols. And that matters. So you think about it, the internet doesn't work. We have 17 different internets. Right now, we actually have a version of that beginning to develop. How many use Slack? How many use GitHub? How many use, Facebook Messenger? All of a sudden you have all these different channels of content. You want to move content from one to the other. You either have to do a workaround, or you're doing a cut and paste, or you're doing, so all of a sudden you have all these different channels. That's not universal connectivity. That's siloed. You can do it, but you have work to do in the middle. They wanted to make it universal so that the system could work. You want to make sure that it's secure. You can't have a system that's open to hackers, so you have to build encryption and socket layers around the communication layer for it to work. Identity is the critical piece that I think is first that we all have to address. Our identity system in the developed world is completely broken, just doesn't work. It's hacked everywhere. With the Equifax hack, half of our information is out there, and yet I did a study, this was 7 years ago, and I did a bunch of research on it, and the conclusion was we don't care. We say we care about privacy, but we care more about convenience. So convenience absolutely trumps identity every step of the way. Doesn't seem to make sense, especially with the hacking that's taking place, but it's more or less, if you have a problem, will the credit card companies actually call you and say, did somebody make this charge? No, and then they're responsible. Credit card companies are responsible for it. That's not true in other countries. Credit card in Brazil gets charged fraudulently, you're responsible for it. How many times have you had a fight over a phone bill? Okay, the phone bill's more like Brazil. Okay, all of a sudden you have large charges, you're fighting with the phone company over that. And so you have that type of a thing that's going on. But the identity system is at the foundation of all of that, because people are fraudulently representing themselves as you. Now, that's true pretty much throughout the developed world. But in the developing world, how do you get people to show where they were born? Do they have a birth certificate? There's a good third to half of the world, depending on where you're going, that don't operate with birth certificates. Okay, so how are you going to find out who that person is? Was she born in this village? Well, who's vouching for that? Who's the mother? There's lots of questions, but ultimately you know that a person is a person. The way in which that's been addressed at the UN level in refugee context is through iris scans and palm scans, but it's only limited to healthcare purposes, because a lot of people are concerned about that kind of identity, but they're concerned about it because if somebody hacked into a database that was centralized that had all that information, they would now have a real treasure trove of information about biological markers that could identify you. But if it's distributed in these blockchain ledgers, that is not hackable. It's a different story. And so I'm not saying that the UN uses it in a blockchain yet, but what I'm saying is that in these refugee settings, they've got that first way to identify an individual, but that's the core of the identity. So you need to verify not just who that person is, but then what does that person's educational level become? What does that person's healthcare look like? What is their financial circumstance like? What are their social networks like? There's a lot of different things that we're all comfortable or not, depending upon who you are, with LinkedIn and other types of networks where you get your reputation built. And in a refugee context, it might be for job creation, and we'll get to that later. But verification is the key part of that, and it really doesn't exist in any normative way yet, other than we're trying to figure it out in different contexts. But even with a verified identity on eBay, which is verified how much? We each have our username and password. We provided certain information to eBay, and we're good to go. So now at that level, and how many usernames and passwords do we have for every single network that we're involved with? And how many of those networks now try to say, like Facebook, well, we'll make ourselves available to this group over here so you can log into this service by just giving us your Facebook information, which of course, if you look behind that in the terms of service, the terms of service will allow Facebook to grab everything that's on your, it's in that system and move it around, because the terms of service give that permission. So these centralized databases of information exist, but that's the level of verification that we have today. And then on top of that, we build marketplaces, because that's what we like to do in the developed world: sell stuff, buy stuff. So there are all kinds of marketplaces that exist, and marketplaces where you can buy stuff directly like Amazon, or just social marketplaces where in actuality we're not doing the buying and selling, we're just creating digital footprints of our activity there. And in the meantime, in the background, all the businesses that have been buying your or getting your identity because you clicked I accept, they're involved in business. They're exchanging all that data back and forth with each other. And now the next time you log on to Amazon, well, geez, how do they know I'm going to New York tomorrow? I mean, I didn't know that. They want to sell me a Hertz rental car? Yeah, I did get my airline ticket, but I didn't get my rental car. How did they know that? All that stuff is going on in the background, and it's all there because that commerce layer has been built out, but not without a strong identity layer underpinning it. The social networks we just talked about. And really, that is the foundation of this identity for all blockchain that we're talking about, because we're all comfortable interacting with each other online. Now, I know a lot of the folks from my generation practice law as long as I have never gone on Facebook, never will go on Facebook, have no interest in being in any LinkedIn network, and that's just the way that it is. They would prefer not to be found. They are happy the way life is. That's just fine. And there are other people that got into this whole network and at some point said, I'm spending way too much time on this network every single day. And then if I don't respond to something, people are getting mad at me because I didn't respond to something. So they get in and they get out. But there is a whole group of people that are reconnecting as you get close to, a anniversary of your high school or your college or your law school or something like that. Next thing you know, you're reconnecting with people you hadn't connected with in 35 or 40 years. And on top of all of that, it's like it was yesterday. And so this whole new operating system exists, and certainly in the diaspora context, which I mentioned earlier in terms of Houston, I think that's really key. If Houston really thinks about how it can move forward, making those connections, this social operating system element of connecting a diaspora and then expanding that out is going to be significant. Right now, it's just you go to an area because they got great food there. You hear about it. Or they got great music there. The Greek festival's taking place here. You got to come here and go to this church, and it's a blast for 5 days. Okay, I mean, people hear about that. Why is it limited to just that? It could be much more built in terms of this operating system that we used it for. But that is a layer that exists up there. But what's missing is this way to make agreements with each other, to make enforceable relationships with each other, to have the ability to have some sort of resolution if issues arrive with each other. We have left that for our existing justice systems. If you think in terms of a local contract, go to the auto dealership, service department, you bring in your car, there's a problem. Well, you go back to the dealer, you say there's a problem, please fix it. Dealer says, I fixed it, I took your money, have a nice day. So you go to the small claims court, you've got a whole resolution system that's built there. Does it work well or not? Everybody has their own story. I'll leave it at that. But if you want to say, oh, geez, my kid went to school at the University of Houston, met this fellow that came in from India. They started, having a nice relationship with the other, and now they want to be partners in some kind of a business. I can tell you in Boston, it happens all the time. There's so many schools there, and so many different people from different relationships there. There's tons of businesses that are cross-border, okay? And they're all young kids, and they get together, they do these simple agreements with each other, and most of them are oral, and they get involved with each other, and all of a sudden, some money changes hands, and then somebody goes back to another country, and all of a sudden, a phone call comes to the lawyer's office and says, somebody ran off with this money, okay? And, and how are you going to resolve that? There's no way to resolve that very easily. You might as well just say goodbye to that money. If you want to spend money, it's good money going after bad money, typically speaking. Unless you happen to be, I have a partner. You're the father, and you have a partner who's in business in the city where the kid came from. Then you might be able to do something, but that's an odd circumstance. There is no justice layer that exists on top of all of these other layers. But that doesn't mean that at the international global level, no forms of justice exist. I mean, here are a couple of examples. Federal Communications Commission operates how the net is regulated. We all know that now because of all the net neutrality arguments that are taking place around the world, in terms of how the bandwidth of the internet is going to be shared and used. Okay, that's regulated. That's governed at a global level. It's not governed at a local level. It's governed globally, the states and then globally, because bandwidth is a resource that has to be shared in some way. And at the local level, we use it. But that's an example of top-down regulation. Domain names. Well, how are domain names regulated? They were absolutely regulated initially by the Department of Commerce, and then eventually that contract went out nationally. And now some international groups are beginning to fight over who's going to be regulating the domain name system. But the domain name is one piece of your identity on the internet. And as you know, you can get as many domain names as you can find, pay for. license. So you can actually take yourself and give yourself 17 domain names. And now that's part of your identity. But people don't necessarily know that because, you know, domain name can look however you want it to look. So they don't know that it's tied to you or you. But how you get that domain name and how it's licensed, that's regulated. And the availability of a domain name, that's regulated. And whether or not you got on early and you got Coca-Cola.com before Coke got it, now that's regulated. And so there are different ways in which that type of regulation is taking place from the top down. But private justice systems, and we talked about this, like eBay, use private agreements. And the minute you click I accept and 100 million people click I accept to the same agreement, that's a private international legal system. And that's the model I think is going to carry forward, except right now it exists amongst the computers with each other. That's going to move up to the cloud with each other, because that's how we're able to function online. There are other examples. A lot of verification systems. How do you know that a site that you go to is private and secure? You want to make sure that you are only interacting with sites that have a certain security layer that's built around them, and they follow certain privacy policies. Outside private groups have developed that say, we will issue seals that you can put on your website that you can pay for once you demonstrate to us that certain standards have been met by the website that you created. And so that's why you have trustee certified privacy, or you have a PayPal verified site, because these groups that are offering services want to demonstrate to all of us, the customers, from the ground up, that we're creating our sites with our websites with the domain names with certain standards. And so you will be comfortable using those sites. And a lot of it relates to security and privacy. Now you've got new systems beginning to develop in terms of reputation. I know that everybody knows this is a mess because now these systems are very easily gamed. And now people are constantly dealing with issues of their reputation online. But that's another example of a service that's trying to move into this identity space. So if you're thinking about it for a second, just realize that one of the real faults of our identity system is that we can all be gamed. We're letting other people verify our reputation, and if they're doing it incorrectly or fraudulently, sometimes a competitor will do that to try to hurt your business. Now we're having to fight that. I mean, this is a ridiculous way for people to be spending time online, but systems like Yelp try to address that. So justice has developed top down and bottom up, but not very effective. That's why we really need to think in terms of a justice layer. I've only put one slide from this group here up. What we really have to think about is that we have to think differently in terms of boundaries. We're standing in Texas. If we operate in this cloud-based system, we're in the globe. The notion of boundaries, we just have to get rid of it. The only time that we need to think about the boundaries themselves is because of your physical location. If you do something that is going to catch the attention of somebody local, well, you deserve to have the interaction with the person who's local, because you are in a place and your person is here and your bank accounts are here and your real estate is here and your car is here and so on and so forth. So other than that aspect of jurisdiction, globally is where we're building this space, because if we're going to build a justice layer, it's operating globally. No different than the communication layers are global, no different than the social operating systems are global. We're creating a justice system that's global as well. And when I say that we have to pay attention to things local, that's just because as we operate globally, we are going to create certain interactions that will affect us right here. And if we are here, then we also are subject to a local system. We have to pay attention to that. So what I would say is that a justice layer begins with a new form of identity. That means we start with zero identity. So the easiest way to understand that is to imagine that you're stateless and that you're nameless. You're a Syrian nurse, run out of the country to save your family your life, and you land in Lesbos on an island with your family. You've been a nurse for 25 years. You are nameless and you are stateless. You have no identity. You have no papers with you. You have nothing. That's the point of view to think about from the beginning, because without any identity, you can't access any form of justice. You might be there being able to get some water, some food, some humanitarian aid just because you're a person in that camp, but that's not who you are, other than you happen to be there. And humanitarian efforts are being driven to take care of the people who are in that connection. This is true for homeless people everywhere. You don't have to go to a refugee camp in Lesbos. You can just go not too far from here. And people who are homeless have the same issue. I need to see your driver's license. I need to see your identity card. I need to see, who are you? I mean, and there are a lot of veterans who are homeless. Really terrible story, terrible situation. So without an identity, you basically don't exist. Because we think about identity all the time. We think about it, and it's sort of an odd thing to think that we don't have an identity. In the music project that I was telling you about, I actually did a project in Recife, Brazil, with some kids from a favela, very difficult area that's all fenced off and so forth. Incredible musicians. And so it came to the attention of the World Justice Project, where my project was supported. There was a big meeting in Vienna, and one of the leaders said to me, "Why don't you bring those kids from Recife and they'll perform in Vienna? Wouldn't that be great?" And I said, "Oh, sure," having no idea what I was about to get myself into. Okay. Well, they arrived, they performed. It was one of the most exciting things ever that could have happened to those kids. They literally, after performing in front of 300 people at the Hotel Intercontinental, a beautiful ballroom stage with people in gowns, and tuxes, and everything else, presidents, Supreme Court justices, and everything else, they're all excited. They're all performing. Then those kids spent the entire night running around to every hip hop joint in Vienna. They got their pictures in the paper. They were on the news. By the time they got back to Recife, they were invited by the mayor of Recife to perform in the carnival. It was a fantastic thing. The only one who suffered a little bit was me, because just before they got on stage to perform, one of my friends, a lawyer from Brazil, who had a couple of days earlier said to me, "Jeff, do you speak Portuguese?" "No." "I'm going to hang around you because I think you're going to need me." And yes, I did need her. She, and just before they got on stage, she told me, they didn't have birth certificates. Remember, these kids came from Brazil to Vienna. That's a couple of airlines, it's a couple of borders, including Paris, where documentation matters. Now, I will assure you, I did not even think about anything in terms of getting them from there to here. They took care of all of that on their own. So I didn't know. And so my lawyer friend mentioned to me that they didn't have birth certificates, just as the start of the particular problem that they were facing. So how they got from there to Vienna, who knows? But I happen to, as I get up to, this is the beginning of the evening, and the founder of the whole thing is welcoming everybody, and then he invites me to introduce the performers. And so the first thing in my mind is to mention that they didn't have birth certificates, because I just heard it. Shortly after that, I'm sitting next to the Supreme Court Chief Justice from Brazil, who's looking at me with cross eyes. Okay, it was not an easy moment for me to get through. I did, but it was a challenge. And all I'm thinking is, these are your kids. These are your kids. They're performing here. Why aren't we celebrating the fact that they're here performing, as opposed to some problem of the justice system? Okay, but who knows? In any case, they created their identity. They figured out how to do it because they had an opportunity. We have to make it easier than that. The size of the problem, we're talking about 65 million people a year being displaced. It's a big number. And the institutions of the world aren't creating systems to protect refugees. The political systems of the world are essentially saying, we'll build walls to keep them out. And historically, walls don't work. Temporary reprieves, but historically, it's a problem. In the meantime, the refugees are in camps where who's supporting them? The UN and then various other groups make their way in and create opportunities to bring people out. Some of those opportunities turn into human trafficking, sex trafficking, other those opportunities turn into terrorist threats. It becomes a problem for the world that the world needs to address. And it can be addressed with the technology that we have. So our project, which is called the Invisibles Project, obviously to make the invisible visible, what we did is create a proof of concept to create standards for verifying identities for any invisible population. So we'll look at the technology in a second, but just as the basic underpinnings of what we did, we essentially said that Syrian nurse, as she begins to put up her history on the blockchain, for this to work internationally, she can't just say, okay, I was a nurse, I worked in this hospital, I went to this school. She can't just say that. There needs to be some system of verifying the information that she's giving. And if that system is accurate and done in accordance with international standards, just like they build runways in an airport, according to international standards, you need an international standard for the verification of identity. And if you can do that, you have an opportunity to move forward. And obviously, I've said this before, what you have in this environment is the opportunity for that Syrian nurse to be able to, once she gives her identity, to be able to work in an online environment and essentially create revenue for herself. Maybe she could work in a telemedicine environment. The technology exists, the jobs exist too. She has a need. Why are we telling her she can't work anymore? That's unacceptable as a society. So how do we restore the identity? This, of course, is just where you want to end up, with personally identifiable information that is trustworthy and verifiable. But how do you get there? You start by saying the essential construct, the legal construct that we own our identities, which is not true. We do not own our identities. We give them away every time we click I accept. We give every piece of our identity away, including the digital footprint that we create as we use our identity in the online spaces. So let's have a technology that says we're going to do the exact opposite of that. We are going to own our identity and we'll only give out our information, pieces of the information that are relevant when they need to be relevant to the third parties that need that information on our terms, not on their terms. So they can only use it for a singular purpose. That technology has been, people have been working on this for some time now. It's called self-sovereign identity, and it's finally come to fruition, and it is really the foundation of what we have. So essentially, the current online identity model is the one on the left, Amazon. Okay? We all give our information to Amazon. We all click I accept. Now, Amazon is in control of all our information, and in addition to Amazon, eBay, and Facebook, and every other group is able to do what they want with it because we've given them permission in the terms of service and the agreements. The sovereign identity model essentially puts you in control of your information, and those arrows basically mean you're giving it out under your terms and conditions. So we will see that in the next slide. So the very first step is that I will provide verifiable claims to a group that accept my claims. In the Invisibles project, the way we came up with this idea, we said, what if you had a group of the UN? We actually brought into mind, because if you're going to scale this, you need to have groups that will scale, and we thought that the military could scale, veterans of war in particular. The reason that came up is because a lot of veterans come back to this country, have no work to do. They went to these places in many cases to do they were trying to help the populations, pull them back from the problems of those societies that they were in, and then they left because it was never done effectively. Now they're back here. So we saw, and they know how to scale. They know how to scale globally. And then, of course, there are other groups, probably youth groups that operate at a global level. But you would build a mechanism by which, as that Syrian nurse says, I went here. Okay, well, how do I know that you went here? Well, this person over there knew me there. So now we have a person vouching for that person. Somebody in Houston, Texas, who is my cousin, who made it to Houston under some kind of a visa, is there. And so it's a family member who's in the States. They can vouch that I was there. Maybe you can get information back from Syria. I'm not so sure, but in some populations, you might be able to go back to the country and get some information and pull that out. But whatever standards that there are to verify those claims, you would do that on an each case basis. So you're establishing not just the identity, but the skill set. That would be an initial step. There would also have to be a way to resolve disputes. Somebody says, well, I did this work for so many years, and somebody else says, no, she didn't. Okay, she only did it for a couple of years, and she's really trying to get a higher job that she's really not qualified for. So you have this initial base of information, but then if in these camps you actually have a place where they can begin to work, right? Do some telemedicine, you might be able to have, like LinkedIn, an ongoing reputation-based system. She just did some incredible work in telemedicine, helping somebody with a fracture in Alaska, and the doctor who now the doctor is a person who's trusted in the system, because the doctor has certain credentials that are built into the system. Says she did a fantastic job, gives her a high rating. So all of those mechanisms need to be built into some standards. So the verification process is absolutely clear. Now, the security of the system comes from the fact that all of this information is distributed to all the different places where the base information comes from. My law degree from Boston University is going to come from a hashtag at Boston University. I might keep a picture of my diploma, okay, but I better keep it encrypted, and it might be so people can't get to that. But so the security is at two levels. It's me being secure, but also all the information is distributed all around the world and all around the network, so that if somebody wants to see that I graduated from this law school, all they're going to get is the hashtag that's going to take them to that law degree over at Boston University. That's all they're going to see. And they're going to be able to know that I graduated at this time. And they won't even see the whole degree. They'll just get the information that if they trust Boston University Law School is giving proper information, then that's covered. That's one way of doing it. And then, of course, the scalability of it really just depends upon the populations that we're working with, so that our aim is to say, if we're starting with refugees or we're starting with populations in the global south, and we're taking specific populations, we're ultimately looking at 3 to 4 billion people that we're trying to build norms with. If we build norms for identity with that group that work over the course of time, those norms will be what we all adopt, because they'll have set the norms for all of society. That's it. So you've now changed the environment. No single organization controls any piece of information. It's distributed everywhere. So hackers would have a heck of a time trying to, put together your identity. And there's Sovereign, which was the name that I mentioned earlier. If you go to the website, it's a .org, so sovereign.org. You will see the number of applications and all the white papers and how they're going to use tokens. There's a lot of detailed information there. we basically are using that as a set of instructions for us to build out the system for refugees. But each individual refugee is in control of her or his own information, whether it's healthcare, whether it's their money, whether it's their relationship in the justice system. Ultimately, we hope it can be for travel, but that's going to involve political connection and involvement, because that won't happen as you cross borders. You do have the jurisdictional lines, and you're going to have to go through those jurisdictions. We wanted to make a statement, though, to the politicians. We wanted to be able to make a statement that with international standards, you can trust the population that we're creating. The idea that everybody that's in this refugee camp is a potential threat because of the terrorist threats that exist in the world is, in my view, not correct. It's, you have a tiny population that might be a bad actor in that kind of a setting. So if everybody is involved in creating verified identity, then you actually have a way of knowing, who's in the camp at a certain level, and it can be done anonymously, because you can gather the pieces of information that you need to show there are so many nurses, there are so many doctors, there's so many carpenters, there are so many people working in the produce area. There's this many with criminal records. This is the kind of criminal record, but you can literally do a census of the population that's there without giving up any individual characteristics. That as long as the system itself is verifiable as you're creating it, it will be trustworthy. Otherwise, you're going to run into a problem where people can say, I can't trust that information because it's just some kids taking notes from somebody who's talking to me, and why should I trust that? Okay, there's no reason for me to trust it. So the verifiable piece of it has to go and be built into an international standard with global groups looking at it while we're building it, or I don't think we'll get to where we want to. So, this ultimately comes back to, a situation where if you talk about Houston, the human trafficking problem in the United States has a significant port of entry right here. And the way in which we fight it here is to delegate the responsibility to the police and the news agencies and people who have nonprofit groups that want to fight it, and then to a lot of humanitarian effort to take care of the people who have been hurt by it but are able to be recovered from it. And I suspect that most people would agree that that is a difficult way to solve this particular problem. If a justice system operates effectively, it creates opportunity for that Syrian nurse in the camp to do work so she can take care of her kids before somebody gets spirited out and put into the pipeline that ultimately leads to a human or sex trafficking kind of problem. You want to catch it and empower people at the early end. And so that human right, and this is the interesting part of the human rights side of it. I go to human rights gatherings with technologists, and what do you think that the human rights groups are talking about in those settings? They're talking about surveillance. They're talking about governments watching me and how we need to put restrictions on governments. So they're trying to use law to restrain the governments, making the assumption that governments are the all-powerful here. How ridiculous is that? I thought civil society drives the agenda. Well, obviously, we aren't in a world where that happens anymore. I know that. But we now are in a position where, because of this new technology, if we build it out as civil society, as opposed to letting the governments and the corporations build it out, because that's what happened, okay? The governments and the corporations built out the e-commerce systems. They built out the terms of service. They built out all those agreements. They didn't exist before 1995. We let them build it out. We had the opportunity to put encryption in place in 1999. It was called PGP, pretty good privacy. The lawyers, it was all there. We were all looking at it. The legal profession said, it's too complicated. We don't need to deal with it, okay? Society followed suit, okay? And essentially, the mess that we have is of our own creation because we took no responsibility for it. That simple, but we have a chance to do it again. And we have to figure out a way forward with it. So what we do at our organization is build these projects out. We do it with legal aid. We do it in these music areas. As I mentioned before, we have a music project that's online. I told you a little bit about that Haiti side of it a little bit earlier. This year, we hope to have several musicians identified in 5 to 10 countries, depending upon how many places we can actually get to. They will all be global south, developing countries. Now, just to give you an idea, that when we were in Liberia, bless you, when we were in Liberia, the kids who showed up at the concerts that we held there, who were doing music, they're all very skilled. They're ready to work. Honestly, those are the kids I need to work with first. You want to talk about low-hanging fruit in an identity system, you want to work with kids who are ready to offer services, kids whose identities can be verified fairly quickly. You can set some kind of a system up, even without having the international standard stuff. You want to show that it works. You want to show that kids from there can actually do work. From Monrovia can actually get work in Houston, okay? And why not with the diaspora that actually exists? Because the diaspora would have a reason to participate. You don't need to have the entire fair trade music system that we're also building at the same time. It's going to take longer to build that system. I've been on working groups where we're sitting there. I mean, I don't want to do the coding. Please leave me alone. I do not want to do the coding of this logic. I didn't like it then. I don't like it now. But you know, there are people who love to code. They love to play around with this logic, and they see how it can work. And we can test it out. But we should test it out simply for simple pieces of music being sold from Monrovia, Liberia to somebody here, or for somebody who wants to compose a jingle for your website, and you know, cost you $5 or $10, and then build out a mechanism for, call it customer service as opposed to dispute resolution. If you do justice right, it's a customer service problem. The shirt was supposed to be red, it's blue, okay? I'm gonna file a claim in small claims court to get this fixed. Sort of too much, right? No, you just need a communication system back and forth that says, we have a problem, what's the problem? Oh, I'll solve it, and we're done. So you need that feedback loop, because otherwise people on the buying side will have less reason to trust that it works. We want to give them every reason to trust that it works. That's why eBay was built up. They resolved 60 million disputes, customer service problems a year. None of them go to the small claims court. If they did, small claims would shut down. Small claims can't handle what it has. It doesn't handle half the cases that it has. You know, huge backlog. You know, all you start dumping these online cases on them, they're not going to be able to function. So these systems work to create that kind of opportunity. So we have this World United in Song project that we're doing this year. In the hackathon, we'll give you a link to a channel if you want to participate in the hackathon version of it. There's a New York node that's working on a piece of this. And you will see the identity piece, self-sovereign identity. You will see a bit of the smart contract piece, but you'll see more of the dispute resolution piece that's being built out. And when you're thinking of identity in the context of music, it's not just the identity of an individual person. It's, you know, who else is participating with that person in the creation of the song? What's their relationship to that music? Are they a work for hire for which they're just being paid, or do they have an ownership interest in it? When you finally get through all those issues that can be built into blocks on the blockchain, then you will have a composition. That composition has its own life. It has its own identity. It can also have an identity on the internet, no different than a piece of land has a deed associated with it. And now every aspect of that song, as it gets sold here, sold there, and you know, in some form as a download, or sold to a music festival to be played, or sold to a movie to be shown in it, that each transaction associated with that music can become part of the identity of that music as well. So to build all that out, we'll start with a small piece, the sale of one item, and the payment for one item, because to build the whole thing out will get too much, too fast. So that's the piece that we'll be doing there. So we hope that Houston, in terms of everybody's involvement, that is, you know, you can do these projects just by going online. There are Slack channels, there are Google Hangouts, and then we'll have these meetups as well where people can come and participate. And as you can tell, it's multidisciplinary. We need everybody to help out here. Everybody has some ability to work on it. So I'll stop at this point, see if there are any questions that you have. Yes.
Some of this stuff looks relatively straightforward. I mean, the authenticating some aspects of you're authenticating a diploma, for example, that's pretty straightforward.
That's right.
But the representation is very different. So, for example, I could have a diploma in mechanical engineering and work in advertising. Now, the problem is I'm working in advertising and changing my representation constantly. One day I'm advertising for a mechanical company, next day I'm advertising for a consumer company. Okay, so the representation changes rapidly and it can be very narrow niche. I just don't see coding working for that to do the authentication properly. I see two different things. One's representation, the other one's authentication. I don't see why. I think representation would be very complicated because it's dynamic and changes rapidly.
How is that done in a LinkedIn setting if you're keeping a LinkedIn profile and you want more business and it's you and you're trying to tell as many people as you can all the different aspects of the work that you're doing? How do you do it there?
Well, LinkedIn, for example, again, is representation, right? Authentication is all the other people claiming that they know you. You can lie on LinkedIn pretty easily, but it's hard to get the other people to sit there. So, for example, you have a diploma from University of Texas, and you have to have 40 University of Texas friends, the authentication is there, but nobody really knows whether you can still do that project and you claim you can do it because the representation is self-proclaimed. So then, for example, I do another representation another day. Nobody knows whether I really did that or not because you can't get the authentication accurately fast enough. I see this as two different things. One's representation, one's authentication.
Well, that's right. Verifiable claims. It's two words. You said authentication, representation. I call it verifiable claims. It's the same thing. The verification is the authentication part. The claims is the representation part. So you need to have claims that are verified. Now, how you verify a claim, in some cases it's easy. In some cases it's going to be particularly difficult.
Right. But I'm saying the difficult part of it is not suitable for programming. I mean, it's just individual, there are thousands of ways of representing it and so forth.
Well, the process of verifiable claims is happening in a face-to-face setting where you are actually pulling in information from the outside. But there is, at least as we're seeing it, in the refugee context, there's going to be, a face-to-face, you're recreating an identity. So it's going to be happening this way, but it might be because somebody comes over here that knows you and verifies things that you're saying. Now, you may not be, let's say the group in the middle doesn't know even the person that's doing the vouching. Well, so maybe you give a trust score to that person of 1 as opposed to 10. Because you don't know who they are. But what happens if the person who's doing the verifying happens to be a doctor with high credentials in the camp, and this person is saying, I saw her do this kind of work, for me over here in the last week. So I can tell you that she can do that kind of work. So maybe you don't know where she got that training. Maybe you don't know absolutely where who taught her and so forth, but I can tell you that I saw her do the work that she represents that she can do, and I, as an individual who you were giving a trust score of 8 or 9 to, says she can do the work. Okay, you continue to gather that kind of information. Maybe you need lots of information in order to reach a point, but at some point, you've got to be able to say, this claim is verified, at least to this level. Maybe it's at a low level of verification, but it goes on the block as a stage 1 verification that she's a nurse who's capable to do this type of work, but that's it. And she can't do any more than this type of work. Now she's, over the course of time, demonstrating with people watching her that she can do very sophisticated work. She should be entitled to come back and make a claim that she now has risen up to a higher level of verification. Can't say that she can't prove herself. I mean, what does a law degree mean? I got my law degree, how many years ago? 40 years ago. It's, what does it say about me? It says that I went to that law school 40 years ago. Doesn't say anything about my capabilities as a lawyer. My capabilities will be more likely verified by my clients, and more likely my recent clients than my older clients, because they can say what it is that I can do.
But the same portion of it is very complex. I mean, you know, that's how Yelp gaming occurs. Everybody says something a little different. It's difficult to get standardization with any program. Yeah, I don't see how you.
Well, you're not all you're putting on the blockchain is not programming that on the blockchain. You're programming, you're verifying in the setting where you're gathering the information,
Yeah.
and then what you're programming is nothing more that they've met this box and they can put it up there. So that's easy to program. It's the process by which you're verifying the claim that is what you're saying is difficult
That's
to
what I'm
do.
saying. I think that's more representation rather than. I just think it's very complicated on the representation.
How do you, I mean, the alternative, which the existing justice system has, is you can't do anything except stay here or go home. And home is not a proposition. And the expansion of the camps is growing exponentially as we speak. Is there another way to deal with that? I mean, you know, that's the reason we're doing this is to try to begin to get people to be able to take care of themselves as opposed to just depend upon humanitarian aid. Certainly, maybe one way of doing it is saying it doesn't matter who you are, you all can work. Okay, you all can work at low-level jobs, and we can create forces to watch you as you move out into these, you know, in Lesbos, they could move out into the produce fields, and they could do a lot of work in the produce areas. It doesn't matter whether you're a nurse or you're a farmer, they all do the same thing. I mean, that lets them at least work, but it certainly doesn't say much about their skills other than they can do that particular work at a time. How do you get the person who says that they're capable in this area to be able to demonstrate that? Is there any way that you could do that? I mean, that's what you're talking about, is how do you, if I make the representation that I can, you're saying, well, how are we going to verify that? I can say, I can show you. So how do I show you?
Workshops and boot camp.
Workshop,
We have like a.
workshops and boot camps is one way, yeah.
The bar exam report.
Tests, certifications. There's actually a group that I ran into at the very beginning of this work called Open World back 10 years ago, and I just contacted them again because he actually developed out much of what you're starting to say, which is sort of an independent way to say, I'm not going to just take your statement here. You want to say that you're capable in these areas? We have a training center over here, and you can take tests, and you can do this, and you can do that. And they would actually physically set up these kinds of training centers to do more of that sort of independent authentication of that representation. So it's not my word anymore, and it's not somebody vouching for me. I actually have to do something to demonstrate in a setting. Would that work?
Well, yes, but that's authenticated. That's different from representation. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but you have to start something. You have to
You
start
have to
somewhere.
start somewhere. I agree. But, I mean, you know, if the objective here is to do a bunch of blockchain coding to do identity's in two parts: representation, authenticating. Authenticating is a lot more straightforward. Either authenticating or not. Representing is very complex because representing you can it's more imaginative, right? And coding is not very good at imagining.
Doesn't it come down to the smart contracts?
Smart contracts becomes what you get access to once certain aspects of your identity, which is all distributed, right? So your identity isn't just one thing. It's hundreds of representations that you're making about you. Maybe it's the most important 5 or 6 or 7 in the beginning. Okay, the representation that this is my eye and this is my hand and it's being recorded is that one's, you know, if you've got the right technology, you certainly have that in place, right? But then once you start putting around that different aspects of your health, well, in the health situation, you've got a doctor who's, you know, doing tests and a nurse who's performing tests, and they're coming up with the information about you. But you're, in a sense, you're representing that because you're there. You're letting them take your blood. You're letting them, you know, answer the question. So it's sort of a more straightforward version of representing, but I can see even the point there. You can say, I feel great. I've never had a day off of work in my life, and then you start hobbling away because you can't walk, right? So you could represent incorrectly there, but then you'd fail on the authentication part pretty fast. So the representing is just step one in the process, but in the representation, you're not putting anything up on the blockchain that's written in code. What you're doing, you might have algorithms here with people representing and authenticating to help the panel in the middle try to figure out the trustworthiness of the statements that are being made. But what makes its way up on the blockchain in different spots would be, it's no different than my law degree is from here. And I have a school that can demonstrate, yes, it did come from there. What's that worth to me? That just depends. But I think what's going on the blockchain is nothing more than the link to my law degree.
Yeah. So before we take a question, you'll be the last question. Then we'll take a break.
I just had a question about how do you guard against like fraud in the authentication? So like with the same doctor, what if everyone knows that hey, if you rob this doctor, they'll say X, Y, and Z about you, and then got this fraudulent information.
Well, as the gentleman here points out, that you're starting with a representation, but if the representation is fraudulent, then the authentication process has to ferret that out. If it doesn't ferret that out, then the system won't scale. You'll stop at ground zero. But there are a lot of people that have been spending time thinking about, well, how would you authenticate a representation to determine the trustworthiness of that representation? And that's the step in the process that begins the creation of the new identity. If we all start with zero identity, then we all have to do this. For me to start with that object here in the developed world is a non-starter, because you have all different forms of identity that you can show and demonstrate, and people are just going to say, I'm going to rely upon that. And that's the end of it. So you're not going to start it here. But if you go to a place where you are stateless and you are nameless, then you have to create, and we're talking, just at the base level is 100 million people that are in that stateless and nameless situation in the world. That's, quite a few. But it doesn't stop there. It goes to those kids in Recife, Brazil, who didn't have a birth certificate. Who are they? Okay? How are you going to, you go there, you go into the favela, and somebody says, oh, I'm the mother, I'm the father. How do you know that? Who's saying what to whom? That's your point. I'm representing, that's my mother, that's my father, and all of a sudden, that person has 27 kids. Well, they're only 22. How do they have 27 kids already? Right? I mean, that's your point, is that you can't. So if we can't figure out the way to get that right, we go nowhere with it. So we have to start simple, and we start with the most challenging of the use cases, which is the refugee camp. But a refugee camp where there are jobs that can be created so they can be tested. So you could bring in educational situations, so you could bring in training situations, and maybe they can only do certain limited levels of jobs. So you're trying to verify things in a safe way, as opposed to just, you're not creating an identity card that gives this person the ability to get on a plane and fly to anywhere. That's not happening at the beginning in any respect whatsoever. The most you're trying to do is get them some ability to work, some ability to help organize and help out in the place where they are, so they can continue to, in this case, we were talking earlier about earning tokens, right? You could actually create a system where people are earning tokens in that environment because they're acting like the mayor, okay? Because they have that skill set, they know what to do. But who's paying them to do that, right? Why are they going to get up in the morning and go and do that? But if they know that, they're going to earn something, their incentive is to do it right, then, the fact that they were able to create a group of 10 nurses who actually were taking care of the people in that population, even if that's all they're doing, taking care of people who are there, as opposed to have to bring in nurses in from the outside to take care of those people. Now you've got people taking care of people on the inside. That's a good thing, I would think. And then maybe there's some incentive beyond that, because somebody's monitoring that and saying, I can see what's happening here, and I'm going to record that. Okay, so that becomes part of the authentication of any representation that somebody made. We may not let that up onto the blockchain, except maybe as a stage one block. okay, that you did this. And that's all you get, stage 1 block. You have to get to stage 10 before it counts for something else, okay? You have to build that system. I don't have the system built. We have to build it together because you have to be the most skeptical that the system is going to work if you're going to build the right system. If you're not the most skeptical, then you're going to build a system that's going to fail somewhere along the way. You have to be very skeptical about it, or we're not going to be able to scale. Somebody will always find a way that there's a fraud, that there's something that's not working right. So, it's important questions that you're asking, otherwise we won't get started.